just so we could start and still have enough time for our network and yourselves to be able to engage student network functionality, I perhaps would like to welcome Golden and invite Golden to do his opening remarks, and hopefully Wendy will be able to join us and take over from there.
Thank you very much, Ben. My name's Golden Maove. I am with the Southern Africa Trade and Investment Hub. We are an initiative funded by USAID, and we operate in 8 countries in Southern Africa. That includes Botswana, Eswatini, Lesotho, Namibia, Malawi, Mozambique, Zambia, and South Africa. And our mandate is essentially to promote economic growth through trade and investment. So we support private enterprises from the 7 countries to export into South Africa. We also support all the 8 countries to export into the US under the AGOA framework. Then we target investment that uses South Africa as its base to expand it into the rest of the region by identifying investment in technology that needs to be deployed into the 7 other sub-regional countries for the purposes of generating growth as well as promoting trade, given the importance of intra-regional trade within the region, as well as trade from the region to the US. So in a nutshell, that's who we are.
Perfect. I don't know if, okay, Ben is still there.
Yes, thank you very much, Golden. Quentin, would you like to introduce, in a few sentences, the work that JBQ Africa is doing?
Fantastic. Thank you very much. First of all, I want to thank this fantastic initiative from African Agri Council. This is pretty much innovative and trying to create ways of keep interacting in these amazing times. And I also want to thank Golden to be part of this interesting panel discussion. So my name is Quentin Rukingama. I'm from Burundi. As Golden was mentioning, I live in Kenya, and I'm the managing partner of JBQ Africa. So to respond to your question, Ben, JBQ Africa is an agribusiness advisory firm contributing to social transformation of Africa. And how do we do that? It's basically by bridging the knowledge gap from the 3 spheres of the society, meaning the public sector, the private sector, and the civil society when it comes to value chain building. We truly believe that one of the things which will accelerate, I would say, African transformation when it comes to agribusiness and the green revolution we are yet to see, it's mainly to build those value chains across board and in our different countries. So that's what JBQ Africa does. And it truly believes into partnership, notably in the core support we do provide, which are threefold. The first one is co-design strategies with different institutions when it comes to the agribusiness value chain. The second element is to implement those strategies, especially when it comes to building those value chains from farm to fork. And the last leg is the one related to the financial solutions to make sure those value chains are vibrant and well-fed with the means to deliver the different food on the table of the different citizens of this continent. So we are in partnership when it comes to the strategy with PwC, EY, Grant Thornton, and Frost Sullivan. When it comes to the tech side, because we also support the value chain building from the tech perspective, we are in partnership with Microsoft and Cropit, which is one of the initiatives of Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Thank you.
Okay, perfect. And I mean, I know, Quentin, in the work that you do collaborate quite a lot with the various stakeholders on this African continent. During these difficult times, what sort of engagement have you seen from the multinationals, from the private sector as well as public sector? And into that engagement, is there any work that's been scheduled with the USAID, for example?
So thank you for that question. I'll probably start before to answer and talk about the different initiatives. I'll probably give our interesting audience what we truly believe at JBQ Africa will be the right way to tackle this uncertain time because of COVID-19, on how can we go and make sure that we build impactful food security, especially during these times. So we truly believe that the first step should be for the different countries to establish what we call a food balance sheet. Basically knowing exactly what food is produced, where, and who are the consumers. That's very crucial. And for that, one of the first crucial steps we need to do is basically building the data. I think many African countries have been challenged with that in terms of building the right data and information to know exactly where the food is produced, from where it's supplied from, how is it moved, and where is it consumed. And this was actually an interesting, I was pleased to see that there's one of the attendees of this event who mentioned it. I think his name is Sean Shields. And that's very crucial. And definitely the private sector can help to build those kind of value chains. Currently, JBQ Africa is in partnership with Cropping, which basically provide a software as a service for farms management and food traceability to help those different players to understand that food balance sheet. So that's the first thing which needs to be done, data and information. The second element is to map basically the players. Who are the players all throughout the value chain, from the public sector, private sector, and civil society. So from farm to fork. When you talk about from farm to fork, we talked about smallholder farmers, large farmers. We talk about aggregation centers. We talk about food processors. We talk about distributors and retailers, or different drop points for the food. So that is very important to make sure of which kind of players are we having in the different countries and how those players can definitely fit into the value chain. Then based on that, you have the data, the information, which was the first one. The second point, mapping the players. Then you develop a simple dashboard in terms of production, supply, and demand. Production in terms of where the food is produced, supply in terms of who are the players buying and selling foods to the business or the end consumers, and demand is all about the end consumers and the different layers of end consumers, those ones who can afford to pay for the food and those ones who can't and who need assistance. So that's the third element. So production, supply, and demand. So the fourth one is, now, once those three first points are done, identifying the bottlenecks all throughout the value chains and see how can we unlock those bottlenecks. And now the last point is creating the right partnerships, as you mentioned, in terms of how the public sector, the private sector, and civil society can work hand in hand. And I think Golden is also sitting in the right perspective to be part of those coordinators in terms of how can we work hand in hand to solve those issues. So that is valid for COVID-19 times, but also beyond. So that's what is very crucial. So now coming back to your point in terms of what are the different initiatives we've seen. For instance, I can mention Nigeria. Nigeria, where Dangote, the richest man in Africa and one of the food gurus on the continent, has gotten in partnership with other players from the private sector, notably Tony Elumelu, who is the founder of the bank UBA, and other wealthy Nigerians, to actually raise more than $200 million to support the government and the country in different initiatives, not only when it comes to food, but when it comes to health and the rest. We've seen notably in Kenya, EABL, which is East Africa Brewery Limited, part of the Diageo worldwide group, which is producing millions of hand sanitizers and supplying for free into the country to support and fight, supports the government in the country and fight against the coronavirus. Recently, I've seen that even Bitco, which is the biggest food player within East Africa, has contributed up to $50,000 to the fund created by the government to support different initiatives, especially when it comes to food security, and delivering up to $50,000 of worth of food to the bottom of the pyramid in Kenya. So something we need to probably to keep in mind: coronavirus is a problem, but I think most importantly in our African countries, we might be facing, because of this economical and social situation, possible unrest, social unrest. And that can come very costly for our different economies. So that's why we need to be smart and think as human beings and how we can support each other to get out of this situation with a lot of solidarity across board, because we are all in the same boat. Thank you.
Okay. And thank you, Quentin. And Gordon, I mean, we know that the AB has been doing quite a lot of work in facilitating regional intertrade, as well as trying to connect buyers and sellers in between Africa and the US markets. How is that work been impacted by the current crisis? And are there any mitigating tools that have been implemented by both African governments as well as the US government?
Thanks a lot, Ben, for your question. And thanks, Quentin, for the contributions you've made so far. To your question, Ben, the immediate impact that we have seen from COVID is with respect to the productive capacity of the companies. You can imagine under lockdown conditions, staff have to go home. No one is available to harvest. Or even when they are available to harvest, the minimum contact that's there between processing companies that rely on smallholder farmers that supply them with the produce means that they are constrained in terms of the speed at which they can harvest and process and get products to market. The other elements that we've seen in terms of impact is trade events. There are a number of trade events that take place around this time between South Africa and the sub-region in terms of the Africa Big Seven, Hostex and others, where exporters from Malawi, Mozambique, Zambia and other countries come to South Africa. All of those have had to be cancelled. And the same applies to trade events where we take companies from the region to the US or bring buyers from the US into the sub-region. All of those have had to be called off. But in response to those aspects or those shocks, what we have done is firstly to engage with the various executives of the businesses that we work with. One, to understand the challenges that they are facing, and two, to understand how they are coping. And thirdly, to identify the gaps that they need filled. And immediately we launched into translating all the trade events that had been planned into digital events. So for example, the Summer Fence Food Show that takes place in June, which brings together buyers of various commodities, amongst which would be your nuts, your honey, and other specialty foods, which are prime products from this region, has been called off. That center has been converted into an emergency hospital in New York as the epicenter of the COVID-19 in the US. But what we've done now is to identify trade promotion service providers that are based in the US who have got contact with the buyers so that they can establish the demand. So in the process, we do our demand mapping to understand what commodities and in what volumes are required in the US market. Then in the process, we lined up all our export firms from the region, and we hold webinars where we actually hold the actual trade events with the trade promotion service providers to prepare our companies from the region to export. But not only that, we also then work with trade and investment promotion agencies in the respective countries, as well as business membership organizations, which can be industry associations, to group the companies so that we talk of resilience at a regional level, not at a company level only. So some of the initiatives that we then put in place is group shipments. So as opposed to each company from Malawi or Zambia or Mozambique or Eswatini or South Africa trying to do it on its own, we try to get them to then ship containers in groupage models. And that way, we are able to get product into the US working with the TPSPs, the trade promotion service providers, but also get the product stored in the US so that the response to replenish the demands from the buyers is a short cycle. So that's what we are doing in terms of the US market. In terms of the regional market, to the point that Vaughan was talking about, we have analyzed the various value chains within the region, and we know that South Africa is the larger economy. When you look at the 8 countries that we're working in, South Africa is 4 times larger in terms of its GDP than the other 7 countries combined. And because of supermarketization, we see a lot of supermarkets driving demand within South Africa. And we have created linkages between manufacturing firms in South Africa and firms that are producing and running out grower schemes in Malawi, in Mozambique, and other places in the sub-region, for them to readily supply to these processing companies in South Africa. I'll give an example of groundnuts. We know that South Africa's groundnut supply has been dwindling, or its own production has been dwindling. As opposed to relying on deep sea imports from Latin America or from India, we have energized the regional supply chains from Malawi, Mozambique, and Zambia, where companies now need to have proper traceability, proper certification to ensure that their products meet the South African quality standards. And as a result of that, a number of companies are now supplying into South Africa. And all of these, we have digitized the trading platforms on which the companies are working. Recently, in response to COVID, we issued a call for proposals from various manufacturing firms in South Africa to indicate what products they are looking for, so that we can link them with the business membership organizations from the respective countries where those products are being produced. That way, we shorten speed to market as well as distance to market by ensuring that the neighboring countries are feeding in the required raw materials and supplying the growing urban demand under lockdown conditions. The other aspect that we also then realize is that much as supermarkets are driving demand, the urban poor, with the rising urbanization, do not necessarily buy predominantly from the supermarkets. They use the smaller shops like the Spazas in South Africa or small tuck shops in other countries. And part of what we are doing now is creating linkages between SMEs in the region with the Spaza shops in South Africa for them to supply directly to the Spaza shops so that the urban poor can also access food commodities even under lockdown conditions. The third element that we are looking at is investment. As you can imagine, cash flow is a problem for most of the businesses, particularly SMEs at this time. And we are working with private equity firms, trade finance providers to link the trade with access to finance and investment and technology, so that the firms are sufficiently equipped to respond to the rising demand for commodities, but with the appropriate financial products that enable them to remain afloat while taking advantage of the opportunities that are available and remaining resilient. So in a nutshell, that's what we are doing as a hub.
Okay. Well, with the fragmented supply chains across the globe at the moment, obviously, for entrepreneurs, they see opportunities as much as you see the risk to the food supply on the continent. And this is a question for both of you. Do you believe that traceability at this stage could help us forecast the market for the future? And does the current fragmented supply chain of food, does it create opportunity for African small-scale enterprises, or is it more opportunities that the larger player will be able to seize and move forward to keep the supply of food going? So, Quentin, the mic is off on your side.
Thank you. So I think it's a fantastic question actually you're raising, and you're right. During any crisis, there are always a lot of opportunities. Now, depending on people who are, I would say, with all eyes opened to see opportunities are. In terms of these fragmented markets and these challenging times of COVID-19, I think small and medium-sized companies have opportunities to position themselves accordingly if they have the right resources. And some of the resources were mentioned by Golden, notably the financial resources, because it will require those companies to think on the top of their feet in terms of where are the opportunities and how can I position myself according to those opportunities. So one I foresee already, and some of the companies, small to middle-sized companies have positioned themselves to, is on the supply chain. The advantage the small companies do have is that they're small and agile compared to big corporates. So they can adapt pretty much fast in these challenging times. So what we've seen notably in Kenya, we've seen agri-tech players and I would say logistic tech players positioning themselves accordingly. For instance, with the partial lockdown, which is translated here in Kenya into a curfew, what we've seen is that tech companies have run directly to sign partnership with supermarkets to make sure that they will be in a position to deliver food on doorsteps. So doing that, they go and try and find what are the right suppliers, sales, companies to get into partnership with, and structure the full value chain in terms of how can I move those goods from those supermarkets to the different customers. So we've seen companies like Sandy, which is a local tech company which went into partnership with one of the supermarkets. We've seen a global company which I think is still within the startup kind of phase called Global from Spain, which now has seen growth in terms of its different businesses. We've seen local companies using motorbikes to deliver, growing their businesses. There are those called boda bodas, which translate into from Swahili to English into motorcycle, and the rest. So definitely there are opportunities in these value chains which are challenged by these current times.
Okay. Now, Golden, in terms of forecasting
yes.
And traceability, do you see that as something that could be used to forecast the market in the future in terms of traceability? Obviously, you're doing a lot of work in that space as well.
Certainly. We like to think of it as actually building innovation ecosystems. So if you look at, let me give a couple of examples, groundnuts. So you have a company that is working with 180,000 smallholder farmers. And what is the biggest problem that you always find in groundnuts in smallholder farming? It's when they harvest the groundnuts, they dry the groundnuts. Then when it comes to shelling, they have to wet the groundnuts for them to be easy on the hand in terms of hand shelling. In the process, they introduce aflatoxin, which makes it a problem in terms of getting that product to market. So there's nothing wrong with the production, it's the post-harvest handling that creates the problem. So in terms of creating traceability and certification, what we then do is we work with a buyer, a processing company, say in South Africa or in the US, who then specifies what their quality parameters are. We then work that back into the supply chain by working with the aggregator in Zambia or in Malawi for them to build that into their supply chain and work it backwards to the farmers. So right now, we have two companies, for example, that we're working with in Zambia, one with 180,000 farmers, another one with 40,000 farmers. They've been able, through that certification system, to work it backwards to the smallholder farmer level and attain the right aflatoxin level by changing the practices in the supply chain. For example, there is no need for them to buy shelled groundnuts. They can buy them in shell and then do mechanical shelling. In the process, they take out the problem of aflatoxin, but they integrate the massive number of smallholder farmers into the supply chain, and they're able to meet the quality parameters in South Africa and in the US. So that way, we've built an ecosystem that is built on traceability and certification, but that integrates the smallholder farmers and assures product quality and gets the volumes to market. The same applies in terms of macadamia. South Africa is the world leading exporter of macadamia, but it's not the world leading producer. It imports from the region, and creating linkages between producers, small and large, to tackle regional competitiveness as opposed to individual country competitiveness is one mechanism that we are using in terms of getting various countries to collaborate to take advantage of the global market opportunities. We then link that with the AGOA opportunity in terms of helping the companies from the region to access those market opportunities while creating regional integration. In the process, it then helps the region to grow together as opposed to one economy growing at the expense of others.
And this is a question directly for you. How do you see governments and organizations such as USAID coming together to minimize as much as possible the current disruptions? And we're looking at practical tools here with some of our partners, and you will see some of the questions that have been posted here. There's a lot of questions around small, medium-scale farms and how governments can actually come to play. But during this current situation, how do you see government and USAID and organizations such as USAID coming together to minimize the disruptions? And this is practical, something practical that our participant can take away.
Thank you. Well, I should qualify first by saying I don't speak on behalf of the US government. I can only give recommendations in terms of what I see. But some of the things that we are doing immediately is that we've identified the critical bottlenecks that are there with respect to getting companies remaining operational. For instance, we've seen that a number of the food processing companies are constrained because while they may implement health and safety measures within their factory, but their supply chain goes all the way to the smallholder farmers who supply them with the raw materials. So any measures that they need to take need to go beyond the factory into their supply chain, into the thousands of farmers that they work with. So some of the measures that can be taken is, I think, prioritizing COVID testing for the essential services, and that includes the farming community, that includes the farmers. Other measures that we have seen is, I think, quick licensing of payment systems. You can imagine a factory that is buying from 180,000 farmers. It requires to pay those farmers, but at the same time, we need to social distance. So deploying quick and viable payment mechanisms that enable these 180,000 farmers to be paid quickly is a mechanism that the government could do by quickly licensing available technology and getting it deployed. The third element that we can do, which we are already addressing with the US government, is to identify existing capabilities that can be redeployed to tackle COVID. For instance, part of what we are doing in the region is we are working with 39 textile firms that employ a lot of people. But under lockdown conditions, they've had to close. But we can deploy those capabilities to produce personal protective equipment that can then be deployed into the sectors that are operational. That can be deployed on farms, that can be deployed in the food processing companies. In the process, it keeps people employed, which also then generates demand for food commodities. In the process, it also provides the necessary PPEs to the workers that are remaining productive during this time because they are operating in essential services. The other area that I think governments could collaborate on is not just thinking in terms of individual borders, but I think to be thinking in terms of regional integration. So for example, if we understood that our supply chains are not just within the borders of South Africa or with borders of Zambia or Mozambique, we could collaborate across the borders. So this looks at trade facilitation, speedy clearance of goods across the borders, support for critical supplies so that we don't get rising food prices on the basis of shortages within the country when the region actually has more. Those are some of the suggestions I put forward.
No, thank you very much. Quinton, I don't know if you have anything else to add in terms of how African governments and organizations and various bilateral organizations can come together to effectively work and minimize the disruptions. But another closing sort of question for me to you is, this pandemic is forcing us to rethink our reproducing food. So we need to start thinking along the lines of producing African food for Africans. But is there still a concern that after this pandemic, we might face a case of famine because we are running out of operational capability to produce for ourselves? Borders are being closed, so everything has been impacted currently. So how do you see us rethinking how we produce food for Africans? And is there a risk that this current pandemic could lead to famine after we've passed this stage?
So good question. Indeed, I think Vaughan has alluded to it during the plenary session in terms of we surely need to focus in terms of how can we be self-sufficient in terms of food production. And that's very crucial. He also mentioned that we are also blessed, and he's right in terms of our soil, and Golden was even mentioning the different crops we are able to grow and how it can work perfectly when countries are working together in terms of supply chains. Golden was mentioning the macadamia value chain, basically coming from the neighboring countries and slightly further and being aggregated in South Africa, packed, and then exported, now making South Africa one of the largest exporters of macadamia. So we should think along these lines. The first thing is really coming back to the food balance sheet, really understanding what do we produce already. Because we are suffering not only from the quantity of food we do produce, but how that food is handled post-harvest. Golden has mentioned it. On some of the value chains, we are even losing 50% of our production, which is crazy. So imagine if that was done in a better way. We will be saving and adding probably 50% or close to that to food ending on the tables of the different African people. So you're right. This first, we need to rethink in terms of how can we make a bigger emphasis on food security, understanding our different markets, our different food habits, because definitely food consumed in West Africa is pretty much different to food consumed in East Africa. You will see that in West Africa, there's a lot of consumption in terms of, for instance, rice. And in East Africa, the focus will be more on maize. And also, I guess, Southern Africa is also having a big focus on maize. So seeing also what could be alternative value chains we could develop. Some of the countries have started to get into those journeys and supported by, you were asking about partnerships, and supported by international institutions, donors, like USAID, through the different initiatives like the one run by Golden. For instance, in Kenya, thinking widely beyond the usual value chains of, I'll say, maize, we are adding a potato focus. And that also will tick the different boxes of rapid population growth and urbanization. So we need to really understand those food habits because they have an impact on which kind of value chain should be produced locally for local consumption. For instance, I know Malawi in the new strategic plan, they've started from 2018, if I recall, running for the next 5 years. So they know that they're big producers of maize, of tobacco, and they're wondering what additional value chains should they develop which can tick the boxes of food security, but also opportunities of export. So now they're focusing on oilseeds, more precisely things like soybean and sunflower. So those are really kind of right exercise to have as a country and well coordinated on how to bring the different stakeholders from a top-down approach to make sure that we're able to deliver in terms of food security for our different countries. So that's part of the rethinking process. In terms of famine, as you mentioned, the risk is there. For instance, in East Africa, we were hit by the drought. Then after the drought, we have the locusts. We haven't even finished handling that issue, and now we have the COVID-19 kind of issue. So we need to be agile as countries to think through and say, how can we make sure that we are not falling into those challenges of famine? This goes back again to the food balance sheet. So we need really to gather the right data and know exactly what are we producing locally. What do we need in terms of food gaps? Because once you have, as I mentioned before, the production, supply, and demand, you know exactly what food is produced, what food is reaching the market, and what is the demand. Some of the countries might be exporters, net exporters of some of the value chains, but most of them in Africa will be net importers of those different value chains. Coming back to the point Golan has mentioned, so we need to work firstly as a regional bloc and see, Atuko has mentioned that, for instance, in Kenya, we do produce 4 million of metric tons of maize, but we consume 5 million metric tons. So we are in deficit of 1 million. So usually we do import from Tanzania, Uganda, and sometimes we are going through a drought seasonally. When East Africa is on droughts, Southern Africa has rain. So we can work closely in partnership with Southern African countries through the different partnership and agreement we have with SADC, with COMESA and the rest, and make sure, for instance, when drought is hitting East Africa, how can we supply, let's say, Kenya from Zambia, which at that time, most of the time, is kind of a food basket for the neighboring countries. So there is a need of strengthening those partnerships even much more during this coronavirus time. Because yes, we can put those curfews, we can put those lockdowns and etc., but we should allow food moving across. Otherwise, we'll be in that situation and facing those famine situations. And putting another layer on that, we can even be facing social unrest because people will not sit at home and waiting for the worst to happen. They will go out there. So that's what we should be aware as countries, as also citizens. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you very much to both Gordon and Quinton. I think we are 5 minutes into the networking. But before I let you both go and invite all our participants and yourselves to go into the networking area, do you have any closing argument, any 1, 2 lines in terms of closing arguments, in terms of the way forward, the resiliency of our food industry, and how we can still address the current challenge? And this is a question from Stalin Dunda. How can we make sure that we addressing the current pandemic crisis and keeping an eye on the current challenges that we're facing, as you mentioned, the locust situation in East Africa? Any closing remarks?
Golden?
Yeah, certainly. Thank you. I think one thing to bear in mind is that actually COVID-19 has its origins in the food supply chain, and managing COVID, we need to be thinking beyond managing a health crisis. But I think we're actually managing a multidimensional challenge, and we need to sustain the economies. And sustaining the economies means that the shocks that each of the countries are experiencing can be absorbed through cross-border coordination. I want to emphasize the fact that I think we've got productive capacity already. I'm yet to see a lazy farmer. I've worked in 37 African countries. I'm yet to see a lazy farmer. When their markets are functional, they will produce. And we know that this time they've produced, but when they don't get remunerative returns, that affects their investment in the subsequent seasons. So to the extent that it is possible, I think we should still energize national markets, regional markets, and international markets, and enable the sectors that can be productive to remain productive, seeing as we are facing recession in sub-Saharan Africa for the first time. We need any sectors that can be productive to remain productive, and we need to channel resources to protect what we have. And that would be my call in terms of policymakers, private sector, civil society. Let's protect what we have. It will be painful, but it's necessary for us to do it so that we can come out post-COVID with some resilient systems upon which we can build for the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Gordon. Quinton?
So thank you very much. I will summarize my thoughts into, I'll say, a few points. The first one is understanding. First, as countries, as players within the public, private, and civil society, we need to understand what do we have and what don't we have. So that's very crucial. And that comes back to the data, the information, and the insights. The second point I will mention is solidarity. What I find pretty much interesting through this COVID-19 crisis worldwide, I guess it's pushing us to understand that we cannot win as individuals this war. Coming back to what the late Nelson Mandela shared with us, no man is an island. And I think this COVID-19 is really kind of an eye-opener for us. Because countries cannot decide, let me close my border, I will not interact with anybody and I'll solve my issues, and expecting to win this war. Because if they go that route, they realize that as soon as they open again the borders, then the situation, the neighbor's problem will still be his own problem. So solidarity is very important. So I would say among continents, between continents, among countries, within countries, as Golden was mentioning, between public sector, private sector, and civil society. The last point is coordination. It's important to understand who are the players, what are they able to do, and that coordination can help improve things related to agility. How can we position ourselves knowing the strengths and the weaknesses of each of us? And Golden was giving a fantastic example of those textile companies which currently are not operating because of lockdowns, but which now can be supported to manufacture masks, which will be very important for our healthy situation. So those are the key points I will mention. So understanding, partnership, solidarity, and agility.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Golden, Quentin. Thank you for your time and your wonderful insights. I think what we are looking forward to now is to actually see practical solutions on the ground and practical work on the ground to make sure that we can keep going and we can put in practice all the great insight that you guys have shared with us. And I'd just like to take this opportunity to thank you once again, thank Boom and Atuko, as well as Yako and Yan, who have presented in the parallel session. I will now invite you to go into the networking area to be able to network with some of the participants. And just to remind you that once you are connected with someone, please do click on the connect button at the bottom of the screen so that you can exchange contact details. Thank you and have a wonderful day.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Quentin.
Much appreciated, Golden. Thanks, Ben. And thank you for the attendees.
Thank you.
Cheers.